Colby, I thought, today our main plan was to talk about some programming for strength, right? Because we talked about muscle growth last time, but I got to be honest, strength is the last thing on my mind. I'm feeling pretty weak looking at your shirt today.
Oh,
A little weak in the knees, maybe.
are you trying to get the Spotify listeners to come over to YouTube
Yeah,
and boost the numbers
yeah.
up a little bit and leave a comment? Because it's working. It's
Maybe they
gonna
should.
happen.
Maybe they should. Um, it is a great shirt. No, we are talking about programming for strength today. I think the plan is to do a similar thing as what we did last time. Keep it kind of not get too deep into these super precise, super detailed weeds, although there's definitely some stuff that we can get into. But we're building that foundation first, right? And then we can always come back and add additional layers on top. So it's like baking a cake, right? You got to have the cake first, then you can decorate it later. So we're putting that cake together. Am I just hungry still after prep ending only a couple months ago? Maybe, but maybe it's just a good analogy. Who knows? Um,
You going for cake though? Like that's what you want, not like a cinnamon roll or something.
ooh, cinnamon roll sounds pretty
I've
good.
been wanting cinnamon rolls, so that was just on my mind. Sorry.
My dad makes some banging cinnamon rolls.
Soon, cinnamon roll showdown next episode. But yeah, I think, like you said, we're talking about strength, and they're when we were talking about it just before this, we're like, dude, there's so much to cover. It's gonna be hard to keep it specific and simple. And I think we got it down though. We're going to be able to, and we're going to, again, like we did last time, focus on the things that matter the most and things that are at least come up in the forefront when you think about designing a program for strength, right? So I think it's going to give you a good foundation to start off and to think about, and from there, like we always talk about again, just testing and experimenting, seeing what works well, and adjusting accordingly. But when it comes to strength, I always like to start with first off identifying what that means, right? Because we've been talking about it right now for the past minute or two, and I'm sure everyone listening has a different idea of what that means. It might mean 1 RM for squat, bench, deadlift, powerlifting style. It could be a 3 RM. It could be just seeing the number on the bar go up. It could be machines, just having the weight on the machine go up, and over time I'm able to do 8 reps, 9 reps, whatever it is. But I think first off, and this is something we kind of really emphasized last episode as well, is just really having a clear, defined goal, and specifically here for strength, clear definition of what that strength means. Because then, again, that's going to have a very different outcome when it comes to designing your program and thinking about the variables that we have to manipulate. So yeah, I think just having that very defined definition is important, and it's something that we don't often think about. And if we're coming with assumptions, maybe we're going to drift towards powerlifting, because that's very common, and it's pretty when we're looking at, okay, how much you bench, bro? Come on, just that's all that matters. That's often the first thing you hear in the
Uh-huh.
gym in general.
Uh-huh.
Or also, we're starting to see a little bit more people asking for squats and deadlifts too, or maybe just your total overall. But strength isn't just powerlifting. It's a big part of it, and it's the sport specific part of it. But strength can mean so many things, right? And it's okay to have those different meanings. You don't have to be a powerlifter to enjoy strength and be a strength enthusiast, if you will, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that too. So yeah, first off, starting off on what that means is important, and then yeah, is that something you normally do in your you have a client come up to you saying, "I want to get strong"? You're like, "Let's do it."
Yeah. Well, what does that mean,
Yeah.
right? We got to be on the same page. The good news is, I think, the same principles sort of apply across because we're trying to increase force production at the end of the day, right? For strength. But I think the more specific somebody's goal is, like if they want to be a powerlifter, we have to do some extra things. Like there's some other things to consider, but a lot of the sort of base level principles can all stay the same, as we'll get into eventually. I don't know when here today, but at some point we'll definitely get into some of those. And but yeah, I completely agree. We got to make sure that we're on the same page, that um, we're not projecting what we think that client's goals are, right? Like some people might not care at all about powerlifting, but we hear strength and we just start programming for that. It's not serving the client the best way possible, right? We got to make sure that we are giving them what they actually are wanting to achieve.
Yeah, and sometimes they might not even know, right? They might have these assumptions themselves where they're like, okay, I want to get strong, so I have to squat, bench, and deadlift.
Right.
And if they want to, great. And if that's an exercise they like, a skill they want to practice, we can for sure incorporate that and make it work. But if that doesn't fit in with time spent in the gym, or it doesn't fit in with maybe their joints, or just get really angry when you do a lot of squatting, right? All these other factors I consider, we don't need to have this preconceived idea that, again, like we talked last episode, squat is king. You need to do a barbell back squat end of sentence, right?
Yeah.
It's coming in and maybe breaking that down for them as well, and then us too, because we need to know that. So I think it's a cool place to dissect. It can be hard, right? Because again, sometimes people have these very big attachments to it, but exploring that a bit further, seeing why that's the case, if it needs to be the case, and then what that means for the program ahead, something that's just necessary to do. So
100%.
yeah.
100%. Well, once we're on that same page, which isn't that complicated, right? It's just conversation.
Yeah.
Really see what they're thinking, and then we come back to, okay, well, now what do we do? So maybe it's helpful to think about, we talked about a lot of programming stuff last time in the hypertrophy stuff. So maybe that can be our jumping off point. Like, what are some of the main differences compared to that stuff? And I think we even mentioned this a couple times last time, is this idea that strength is a lot more sensitive, and we got to be kind of more careful with how things are interacting. So do you want to kind of use that diving board, kind of spring off that just a little bit, and talk about that sensitive thing
Yeah.
of our feelings?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was
Princess,
gonna say. Sometimes,
sensitive snowflake.
if we're not strong, we're sad, and
Yeah.
that's okay to be sad. But how do we be less sad and crush our spines with more weight? That makes us happy.
Yes.
But yeah,
Or at least you can be strong and sad.
yes. I mean,
Better than just sad.
what does your shirt say? What is you said about my shirt? But don't you have a
Oh,
cool shirt on too? Bigger,
yeah.
stronger, sadder for
Let's
those
go.
without the video.
Shout out Omar and Rascal Girl.
Yeah. But yeah,
Sponsor
it's
us.
yeah. Yeah, the sensitivity of strength, it's tough to kind of put into words, but there's essentially what it comes down to is just there's so many factors that can influence strength, and it's even more so the case for strength specific rather than muscle building, right? Because when you look at strength, and specifically in this case, if we're talking of the big three like squat, bench, deadlift, or these barbell specific movements that are very skill based, and again there's more variables to consider, like your bracing, like your technique, and the smallest deviation can lead to a big change in your actual pattern and then force production, and that kind of just translates into everything else too. So if even the slightest variable is off, and there's a lot of variables, that can then influence your performance, and then that can influence how you're thinking about your performance. And that itself, you kind of go through this cycle of, okay, what's going on? And I think that's one of the biggest things, is kind of navigating the mental minefield, if you would, of strength sport and strength training, because it can be very defeating, right? Where you're like, okay, I did the same weight before, but I failed the rep. Now this session, does that mean I'm not strong or I'm losing strength? And this is where comes the idea that I always like to frame it is, it's more so the expression of strength that is very finicky rather than strength itself, right? Because when you talk a little bit more down the line in specifics, but you shouldn't always be ready to hit a 1RM, right? That's something you work towards in a sense. And I mean, you could hit a 1RM, but it's going to be very different if you're not used to handling heavy loads. Again, that skill part of it, of walking out the barbell with the squat, of taking that brace, that comfort level, again, the mental game as well. There's so much skill involved in it that if you're not practiced in it, that can then influence your actual performance, right? Again, not necessarily that you lost strength or you're not stronger than before or any case of that. It's just you're not used to it. You just need to get a little more practice so you can express your true strength, right? So I think that's kind of something I always like to talk about in assess. Is just okay. Again, once we have that definition of strength, calming the waters of the mind.
Yeah.
Of
That's a good way to
hey,
put it.
it's we're not always hitting 1RMs. We're not always going to be training super heavy, right? And yes, we do at some point need to do that, but when is it appropriate to do so? And I think that's a very important thing to remind yourself of. It's like, when is it appropriate to make changes and have these goals for specific blocks of training or whatever it may be? And when can I load up some heavy damn weight on the bar and just go at it?
Yeah. And some, there might be a listener here or there who's aware and might point out the daily maxing stuff. Some people do this, right? We have a abstract up on the wall in our lab of some people who did this.
Some crazy people. You forgot
what was
to
that?
emphasize
10
some
years
crazy
ago
people
now or something?
Yeah.
That literally squat 1RM every day for, what was it, 30 something days?
I think it was 30 days exactly, or 31. Yeah.
Okay. And they got stronger, right? But if you just look at that, it's like, oh, we should do this all the time. But if you dig a little deeper, they felt horrible, right? So there's two things. One, the strength is going up and down all over the place. It's really erratic. The trend line is positive, but they're just so beat up, it's not sustainable. right? So even though you can, if we think about like specificity as a training principle, right? You can train with really high specificity for a while, and it can work for a short period of time. It's just not sustainable to do forever, right? So like you're saying, having those periods where we're not doing that and then working our way back up, it's just, in the looking at a month or a couple of weeks in a vacuum, are you going to be as strong in that month? Maybe not. But if you're looking at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, it just works so much better, right?
Yeah.
And then I want to emphasize what you said about calming the waters. I think strength in general, especially powerlifting, but strength in general, because it's so focused on the numbers and the data, and we can see graphs and we can do all this kind of stuff, right? It attracts a certain type of person a lot of time who is really interested in the data, and they love seeing the number, and they love that objectivity to it and all those things. And when that number is not going the direction that they want, it can feel very discouraging. It can feel like, one, what happened? Why is my program so bad? Like, why isn't this working? I need to change everything. Maybe not. Maybe you're just fatigued, right? There, so there's a bunch of stuff there, or there's a lot of identity that gets tied into certain numbers or certain exercises or whatever, and that can be really difficult to navigate for some people. So as I'm sure it'll come up here, and if not, if we do another episode like this where we're getting into like much more detailed stuff, the psychology around training for strength is huge, man. It is absolutely huge. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of underscore what you said there, and just emphasize how vital that is to set those expectations on the front end. We're not going to be hitting a PR every week unless someone's a complete beginner, right? In that case, they probably will for a little while, but it's not going to be super, super frequent. We need to not be super specific all the time. It's kind of, we're playing that long game, not as much of a long game as hypertrophy maybe, right? Because we do get to kind of come up and smell the roses every now and then when we go to a test day or a competition or a whatever kind of test you want to do, in a 10 RM or 5 RM, whatever it is, right? But having that expectation up front is very important for managing the psychology over the long term, which I think ultimately is what keeps people coming back for the very long term, which is how you get to be your strongest, right? Your one training block isn't going to do anything in the grand scheme. It's all about what'd you do for those 15 years,
But you guys said this last episode all the time. Put in some work on the front end and really think about these goals and these things. And I just want to think. I just want to lift weights. That's why I'm doing this strength sport.
Yeah.
And it's, if anything, like we're kind of discussing now, for strength, like because it's so sensitive and there's a lot more to think about, we do want to put that effort in ahead of time. So I really want to emphasize that too. Is that I know it might seem like we're just talking. We're just talking. Not talking specifics yet. We will, but it's like it's really important because again, how you preface it all and how you set your expectations and manage your expectations will make the difference of how that block is then executed, right? If a client or yourself, if you know why you're doing specific things, you're going to most likely have a better chance of doing them with intent and with success. And then down the line, like you said, all that adds up. And that kind of brings us to the point, like you said too, is you every now and then we're seeing strength is improving in some way, right? And I think that's where we get a lot of buy-in from people, is that they, for strength, you see the number go up or you're lifting more than you did before. And that's exciting, man. And that's like, I like to see that. So I'm going to keep up at the gym and continually push that number up. So it's just one of those things that we want to ride that wave as well. If people are excited about that and we want to point out those wins so it keeps that excitement for training for sure, right? Or maybe you have something integrated in your program where it emphasizes that, like an AMRAP at the end of your set, or you're doing top singles, whatever it is, maybe more advanced stuff. But it's regardless if you're keeping that the end goal, and as a client or as a coach rather, if you're keeping that buy-in somehow, I think that's important, right? And that's instead of whereas maybe hypertrophy, we're like, hey, we're just gonna be lifting weights, and maybe next year your sleeves will be a little bit tighter, man, to get the biceps. This is like a year. What do you mean? Whereas for strength, you might start to see those things a little bit more quick. 4 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is. Small differences, but still some. And that continual excitement to surpass that or improve that in some way, and then see your true strength down the line when it's more appropriate to, is cool. And that kind of again just all ties into that idea of managing the mental side of things for that. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's why, like it sort of became a cliche there for a while of the off-season bodybuilder was doing powerlifting,
Yeah.
This is why, dude, right? Like hypertrophy just moves so slow, especially when you're really advanced. So like having something to keep you engaged, and like I don't have to wait a year or two to see a tangible result. I can see something in 3 months or whatever. It just really increases that motivation to keep showing up, right?
And then the opposite side too, and this is kind of one of the big differences as well, is if we're playing that long game and we're not always doing very specific, low bar powerlifting specific squat one rep. Like maybe we're doing high bar squat in the off season. Like that's different from hypertrophy training where you're often doing very similar stuff. You don't need as much variation, or your variation isn't as different as it might be for strength. And that again is too can be tough to get that buy-in and understanding of like, well, you just talked about specificity, coach. If I want to be good at low bar squats, why am I doing high bar squats for higher reps at this point? Well, let me reframe it. Maybe we're far away from competition. Again, I mean, the main difference is where it's strength versus hypertrophy. It's easier to work back from your competitions or your strength tests, whatever it might be, because you then have a better idea. Whereas for hypertrophy, if you're not competing in bodybuilding, you often don't have much of an end date. Maybe it's a photo shoot, and there's other ways to do that. And I think that's an advantage that you can do and work with. But it's, again, harder to see that more long term. Whereas for strength, you can be a little bit more, it's like more intuitive in a way as well. Whereas,
Yeah.
after at least 12 weeks, we got to see where we're at to make sure we're somewhat making progress if you want to. So like that idea again of kind of main movements versus accessory work, then versus like the idea of, well, is there transfer of movement into the specifics? So like that's kind of a can of worms we can slowly open right here. But yeah, like why does that happen where there's very different blocks for strength training?
Yeah, I mean, so okay, we're going there already. So I guess we
Well,
can
I
get.
mean, or unless was there something you want to touch on behind that?
No.
It's like,
We had to pick one of these things, right? They're all
yeah,
kind of because they're all tied together also at the end of the day. But so that gets at the idea of like periodization, right?
mm,
Which by and large, the research would indicate for something like strength does seem to be beneficial to have this thing. For hypertrophy, there's not a clear benefit, although those studies are not designed to maximize hypertrophy. So it's kind of shooting itself in the foot, sort of. Not that the research is bad, it's just we're trying to ask a question in a meta-analysis of this research that research was not designed to answer, right? So we just need different studies that we can then look at. Anyway, the periodization stuff seems to be helpful for strength. Periodization meaning this logical, sequential changing of training variables to get to this endpoint, whether that's a competition, whether it's some sort of test you want to do in the gym, whatever it is, right? But we're sort of working backwards, I think is probably, I would imagine you agree, that's probably the best way to do it.
yeah.
If we have like a certain date, especially. If it's there's no specific end date, we just want to work up towards something, right? You can just kind of gradually get there. But for the most part, working backwards, I think about like reverse engineering is kind of a term that makes sense in my head. And you probably the best way to do that, although there's not super clear research on this, just because like people haven't tested every different type of training block sequence or every different type of hypertrophy block you can do. Like there's no research on that, right? So we have to take the concept in general. But it seems like the gradual increase in specificity is probably what's getting us there, right? So in case of strength, we want the load to go up, right? That's kind of the most specific. If you're trying to get a higher 1 rep max, the highest load that you can use, gradually want to use heavier loads on average, right? So the typical thing that we usually will see is farther away from that, some sort of lower loads on average, maybe a bit closer to failure on average, a little bit more hypertrophy stuff. And then after that, transitioning, just kind of turning that dial a little bit, right? A little bit heavier on average. Maybe we stay a little bit further from failure on average again, right? Because we need to free up some of that recovery space because it's just heavier weights, lower reps, that kind of stuff. General strength, you might think of that. Then you can turn it up even more, right? And you can think of this as like peaking, even heavier weights, even lower rep sets, maybe even further from failure for most of what you're doing. And like that general process is probably the for a reason the most popular archetype that a lot of people will use for powerlifting or like strength in general. And there's infinite ways to do things within that framework, but that sort of overarching concept, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. How do you feel about that before we get even deeper into that?
I think you nail it. It's hard to even to talk about it in such a broad way, but also specific way. But I think
Yeah.
what it comes down to is just, like you said, that idea of fatigue management is much more important now. Right? Because not only are we dealing with just general fatigue, it might be, joint fatigue. Because if we're doing low bar squats, for example, right, and you're hitting heavy loads, because we want to be specific with heavy loads for 1RMs for powerlifting, that's going to come with different types of fatigue and maybe more of it, right? So it's we need to be really mindful of that, and it comes to that idea of we can't always be hitting heavy stuff all the time, and that's why we most likely periodize, because we want to stay healthy and we want to be able to string together consistent blocks of training and be able to build resilience in a way so that we can, then perform at our best. Like you said, there's not much research behind, okay, how many times should you be in volume phases versus strength phases versus that, and we don't really know. But I think one easy way to look at it is just what's going to keep you injury free for the longest time.
Yeah.
Honestly, because with lifting heavy loads, especially for 1 rep maxes, there is a higher chance of injury, and that's not to scare you. And the percentages are still very low compared to like contact sports, right? But it's a little bit more than, say, bodybuilding, right? Because like we talked about in the last episode of bodybuilding, with machines, we can take it closer to failure. It's safer in a way to do so. And we're higher reps, and we're maybe not using as heavy loads. So there's just less of a chance of it happening. Still a chance, and that's why we need to be smart. But there's more to think about in the case for strength, and even more so the closer you get to these barbell specific lifts. So I think that's why we periodized, right? Is to just make sure we're staying injury free, but also to, I think, keep things interesting, right? Because if we're doing low bar back squats for forever, sometimes it gets boring. Yeah. Right. And if you like boring, then you should be doing bodybuilding, because that's what bodybuilding is. If you like interesting stuff, then that's why most people do strength stuff. It's appealing. It's cool. It's nice to see someone lift a heavy load and be like, damn, that's just impressive, rather than just doing higher rep stuff and hoping a year or two later things work out. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But it's I think the periodization is the key of it. It comes down to fatigue management, keeping things interesting, but also I think maybe underlooked thing that is, I think, starting to get some more attention is the idea of spending time away from the big lifts to focus on building muscle, so that we can then theoretically have the chance to be stronger down the line, because theoretically a bigger muscle is going to be a stronger muscle. Right. So I think
in the long term, right?
Yeah, sure. In the long term. So that's the thing. If we're thinking about that long game, like we always talk about, is doing low bar back squat 1RM close to 1RMs going to be conducive to that? Maybe if you look at that 30-day study of 1RMs all the time, you might feel terrible, or it might not happen, or you might get injured, or you might just burn out and be like, I don't like to do this stuff. So keep things interesting, twist it up a little bit, still keep some main lift stuff in there, but focus on that long term of let's build some muscle. And then this brings that idea of, not only is that the case of doing so in different blocks and having themes of blocks, right? It's just when within your actual week of training, I think giving a purpose to the movements itself, right? And what I mean by that is, okay, I have my competition lifts, my main lifts. I'm doing I'm going to stick with the squat thing. I'm doing my low bar squat. I have a top set and then 2 back offs, and then I have accessory work. And this is, again, one of those main differences, is the idea of main versus accessory lifts or exercises that we talk about with the strength specific stuff, is giving that purpose of why are we doing this accessory movement. So as a coach or as a client, really emphasizing why we're doing this is important, because it's hard to say we're doing this to get a better squat, because that's very broad, but also like what evidence do we have for that? Like if we're doing reverse banded explosive 40% 1RM stuff for 2 reps, like, is that going to have more transfer, meaning like it's going to help you out your actual low bar squat more than building more muscle over time with the leg press? I don't know. But these are things that we probably want to consider in choosing which exercise to pick when we're trying to create a program. So it's kind of a lot there. And again, it's tough to talk about, but I guess, the main thing here is different blocks, different goals of blocks and purposes within each block in microcycle or week of training, giving a purpose for the lifts itself, main versus accessory work being kind of the big difference.
Yeah. That was really good. I think it's starting to kind of tie it together here now, right? I think the next logical question of tying together all the things that you just said and that I said before that, even bringing it all together, is when we go to make this kind of longer term plan, moderate to long term plan, whatever, and we're trying to keep an eye on this whole periodization thing. We got these different blocks. Like, okay, well, the sequence makes sense, but like, how long should I spend in each of those portions? Should that change depending on XYZ factors? And then within each of those, like for example, you mentioned accessory work, primary work, back offsets, whatever. Does it make sense to change like how much of your total training dose you're allocating to each of those things? Right. So again, this is a lot, right? There's a lot going on here. That I would imagine that we're not too dissimilar, right, in how we sort of think about these things. But I guess I'll throw out like one or two things here, and then kick it over to you, I guess. So like one of the basic things for me, how long to spend in each of these phases, right? Hypertrophy, general strength, peaking, whatever, right? Whatever words you want to use. Those are the ones I like to use. They make sense to me. Whatever. One of the things I like to think about is like, how long has this person been training? That if they're much earlier in their training career, it's probably going to benefit us in the long run to spend some more time building muscle, right? But we don't want to only be building muscle, because then they're not going to be testing their strength and seeing that hugely motivating progress. So we got to still balance it, but just leaning a bit more. Maybe we do, 2 hypertrophy blocks in a row or something, right? Or some people are super bought into the long term. You can do 3, whatever. Some people are cool with even more than that, right? They might do 6 months or something, right? They might be willing to sign up for that. I've had that before. I think in that case, we need to be cautious not to get away from the strength specificity too much, right? It's, and when we say hypertrophy focused block, it doesn't mean hypertrophy only necessarily. It can. That's not a bad thing to do. I tend to find much better results by having some, I think about, it comes back to that spectrum we've talked about so much, right? Hypertrophy focus is like a little bit of strength and a lot of hypertrophy. General strength is kind of, mostly strength, but still a solid amount of hypertrophy. Peaking stuff is almost all strength and just a tiny bit of. That's how I kind of think about it. Obviously, there's wiggle room within all those, whatever. But especially if we're extending out this hypertrophy phase, having some quote unquote minimum effective dose trademark pack for strength stuff. I remember this time.
I already wrote up the last one. He said his lawyer team's on it, so he'll give me a message back afterwards. But,
that I think that can be helpful in these hypertrophy, some minimal strength stuff, and then go put a bunch of your effort into, getting as jacked as you can, so on and so forth, right? Whereas if somebody is more advanced, they might benefit from being a bit more specific on average. Again, still having the hypertrophy stuff, still having the less specific stuff, but just not as much of a focus on that. Some people, when you get super advanced, the logical extension of that, right, is someone's really, really advanced, so we got to be really specific all the time. And on the surface, that makes some sense. But then when you actually try it, they just get beat up so quick because they're so strong, and they've probably had some degree of injury history. And if nothing else, their elbow starts to hurt when they bench too much or whatever, right? Something minor. That now sometimes that less specificity is purely there for fatigue management, right? Rather than the training adaptations itself. Like, you can do both, and we can balance both of those things. So anyway, those are a couple of the things that I kind of look at for those different block lengths or different phase length things, so to speak. And I think enjoyment's probably another one. Like, if somebody they're just super burnout on doing really specific stuff, like, cool, let's do something else, right? Let's keep some minimum amount in there just to keep you from feeling too rusty, keep you, from when we come back, but put almost all of our energy into hypertrophy stuff just to keep it fun, right? Or vice versa. That happens all the time. Or, I've had a handful of clients over the years where they're just like, dude, I don't really care about training right now. Like, I feel kind of, I don't know, like I'm floating, purposeless. What am I doing? And so that I'm like, the only question I will ask is like, what sounds fun right now? Right? 1 RM? Cool. Let's do that as soon as we can, or whatever it is, and sometimes you're making those decisions that might not make the most sense in the longest term, but in the short term, it's worth it because it keeps them in the gym, keeps them engaged. They feel refreshed because they did this thing that's fun. Now I feel more bought into the long term, whatever. So I guess to kick it to you, do you have any other things that you look at on that front, or if so, afterwards, or if you don't, if I hit most of the things, maybe it might be interesting to think about, like, how do we go about allocating, primary squat, bench, deadlift stuff in a powerlifting example or whatever, main lifts versus accessory stuff or whatever? Like, how do you kind of think through that decision?
Yeah. I think for the first part, yeah, it's very similar. Is if we have that goal, working back from that. But then I think most importantly, is in the end, is keeping things fun and keeping the interest there. And like you also said, it's a two-way street of where are we at in terms of enjoyment of those big lifts versus the accessory lifts, right? So we're keeping that differentiation between main lifts and accessory movements. Some people love the main lift so much that they never want to get away with it. But as we talked about, we probably want to spend some time away from it, or at least have it be less specific so that we can stay injury-free, build some muscle. Because again, we're really concerned about that long-term investment in that payoff in the end there too. So where on that spectrum, again, do you lie, or does your client lie? And keeping that exciting. Because as you also said, and something we always talk about, is just adherence and enjoyment is going to be that main focus. Right? What's going to keep you in the gym consistently? If it's hitting some heavy stuff, we can still make it work, right? We'll hit some relatively heavy stuff, but maybe we're doing something like, for example, all right, instead of hitting a 1RM, right? You like 1RMs, you're very strength focused. Instead of hitting like a 10 RPE, like maximal effort lift, maybe we'll hit a heavy single, right? We'll do a heavy single at 7 RPE or 8 RPE, right? 3 to 2 reps in reserve, where it's heavy enough where you need to be focused, you need to be dialed in like you would maybe a maximal lift, like a 1RM, but not so much where it has an increased chance of us being worried about your fatigue management or failing lift. Because again, we don't want to be failing lifts if we're super far away from a competition because morale might be down. So how can we keep that interesting while still, ticking the boxes that we need to for the block that we're in, right? So as you can see, it kind of has this logical progression of goal, where when it happens, time frame of it all, keeping interest there, keeping adherence there, and then again that overarching fatigue management thing. And that's all just more important when you're considering strength versus hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why we're spending the time talking about it and with thinking about these specifics. When it comes to hypertrophy, again, just kind of, you're just doing it. Not to say that it's simple and it's easier to do, right? It comes with its own hardships and its own difficulty. And it's just different, right? And people drift towards different things. But then how do we get the buy-in from the people who like to be on either end or somewhere in the middle? And I think, again, it comes down to how we're explaining that both to ourselves and then to our clients, and how we're prefacing it of, hey, you want to be stronger? Well, then we need to be in this volume phase because we need to build the muscle. Because you're just in the past, we have the data where you yourself, your elbows get beat up from all this low bar squatting. So why are we going to force that if it's not happening? And if we don't know, maybe we haven't spent enough time in a volume block to actually know, maybe we need to stop competing so frequently or testing our strength so much, right? We need to spend some time away from it and be less specific and see where that takes us and get that data and see then how that fits into the timeline of all this and the enjoyment side of things. So it's very much is that long game, but different than the long game of bodybuilding, right? And I think that's what's hard. And I think it's what I am unfortunately seeing is people jump into strength. They see maybe the beginner gains a little bit earlier. They get that buy-in from weight on the bar going up, and every week they're hitting PRs. It might not be like 1RMs, right? But their 3RM or their set of 5 is just 10 pounds every week, right? And that's exciting. That's good. But once that slows down, what do? If you didn't put the work in earlier, if you don't have a coach, it's really hard to navigate that space physically and mentally too. Because again, you go down that line of, am I just weak? Is this thing for me? And then, that's when that burnout comes in. And I see a lot of powerlifters or a lot of strength specific people getting the burnout and getting it very early because, everything that used to work isn't working anymore. The beginner gains are drying out, or things are just harder, or life throws different curveballs and, you're not able to spend 3 hours in the gym anymore. Not that you have to, right? But a lot of powerlifters, maybe they spend a little bit longer because they want to, or they like to, whatever it means. But it's one of those things where, okay, we need to be aware of all these variables and adjusting for, and then that helps us decide where we're at in the block, where we want to be, and the variables then fit in with that itself too, right? So there's all this going on that we need to be aware of while we're programming, right? And I think that's where, again, just being flexible is extremely important here. It's important for hypertrophy and just life in general, being flexible about stuff, but for the strength too, I think is important. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I think one thing that's kind of come to mind as you're talking through that, you see these people, and this was me too, absolutely, that you're getting those beginner gains, you're getting stronger every week. It's awesome, right? You're so motivated. You get this, like, there's so much momentum built through just the hard work, right? You're just like, yeah, I'm lifting heavy, like, lifting heavier next week, heavier next week, heavier next week. And then you hit that wall where things start to slow down. And, one of the initial thoughts in my experience that most people have, and that I certainly had, is I need to work harder, right? Valid thought, totally. But in a sort of weird paradox, counterintuitive nature of strength for hypertrophy, sometimes that can be the answer, right? Like, I'm not saying that it always is, but sometimes it's, are you actually training as close to failure as you think? Can you do more volume? Can you, whatever, right? Can your execution be a little bit better? Can your technique be better? Can you milk out that stretch position? Whatever, right? There's little things like that that can be working harder. For strength, it's, what we're seeing in the research lately is that, like, kind of less is more. A lot, hypertrophy, it's like more is more on average, right? Until you can't recover and all those sorts of things. We talked about that a lot last time. Strength, it's kind of less is more, right? It's like proximity to failure doesn't seem to matter, which means that probably the better choice is to be further from failure, right? If you get the same gains either way, might as well do the less fatiguing one, right? Why do extra work for no reason? And then on the volume side of things, not to get too deep into that yet, but it's like, you don't need a ton, certainly not as much as you would if you're trying to max hypertrophy out, right? So that's such a weird mental hurdle for a lot of people to get through, right? In that kind of early intermediate stage where things start to slow down. And, I think if you get too wrapped up, as we mentioned earlier, into the identity of being the strong person or whatever, or being the person who just keeps getting stronger and stronger, if you have a hard time going through these different phases and being like, okay, well, this is kind of stagnated. Let me go back and cycle through. Let me do some hypertrophy phase, whatever. So I do think there's probably something to the idea of like homeostasis and adapting to a certain stimulus. If we just always spam the same thing, your body kind of gets used to it. That's how almost all biological things work. So I would imagine strength is sort of a similar thing, that it's probably beneficial to go away from it for a short time anyway. But so when you kind of hit that point, I think navigating that, then being okay with making these decisions of, let me do less low bar squats, right? And do some high bar, do some hack squats, do some whatever, right? Let me do some pause squats, etc. Just being able to make those kind of mature decisions that feel like working less hard, but actually sets you up for better progress. It's like one step back for 3 steps forward,
Yeah, I think super well put, and it's tough to do that. It
It is
really is for yourself.
tough.
Maybe harder for yourself. Again, another reason to get a coach, but also if you are a coach, to try to get people to see that, right? And because people respond differently to that, they're so tied into it where it's harder for them to see.
Mhm.
So you have to figure out, how do I get the buy-in? Sometimes we're diving in the opposite end. Like you said, we are going to go like the end of the hypertrophy spectrum, where we'll do the minimal that we need to for, like, we'll hit a top set of the low bar, and that's it. But we're doing pendulum squats, we're doing all the fun bodybuilding stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so that we can then detach from that stuff, but then get excited to get back to it, keep yourself
Mhm.
healthy, all these things, right? So yeah, I think it really comes down to the mental thing. But as you started to allude to, I think we can start to get to it now if you feel good. Just, we have all the spaces down, we have our goals set, we understand what strength is, we understand the importance of the periodization side, and I'm in a pretty good spot mentally where it's like, yeah, I feel like I can now progress and get into the microcycle side of things. So like you started with for hypertrophy, if we're looking at the frequency side of things, what do we got? Anything that's super different here, very similar, or what's your key? Do you start with frequency, or do you start with something else when programming strength? Or and it,
Strength. Yeah, I probably start with frequency. Frequencies, well, and I think of it slightly differently. I think of frequency of the movement pattern for strength, right? Not necessarily the muscle group. Because you could squat twice and then do leg extensions on a third day, but is that really 3 times frequency that's going to help with your squat? That's kind of a difficult argument to make, I think. There's something there, but anyway, a little bit of a stretch. So I tend to think of it that way, frequency of the movement pattern that we care about, because again, like we talked about, strength is a skill. It's specific. It's, so if we're trying to get a stronger squat, we probably need to squat, at least some sort of squat, even if it's a hack squat or something. It's something. So probably starting there. And it seems like there is certainly a stronger effect of frequency for strength than it is for hypertrophy. Like hypertrophy, it's very small and inconsistent, right? Is sort of the takeaway, like the meta-analysis that we put out, right, on volume and frequency for hypertrophy and strength, that can be very helpful, I think, for this discussion. That for hypertrophy, dose responsive volume, awesome, but the frequency stuff, it's like, like I think you can make, as we did last time, a pretty strong argument that greater than once a week is probably a good idea most of the time, but it's just hard to have much confidence and takeaways beyond that. The strength side, I think it's pretty hard to argue that once a week is the best that we could do. Now, taking into account the limitations of the research, Ray Williams is not a subject in any of these studies. Okay. So like, if someone's super crazy strong and they're super advanced, then, mileage may vary a little bit. Most of the people listening to this, or who are, for coaches, most of the people that we're working with, we're probably looking at, I would say on average, most people are going to squat and deadlift twice a week, maybe 3 times on a squat, right? Sometimes benching, we're probably looking at 2 to 4 times a week for the most part. Sometimes you can see 5. I've seen people bench 6 times, right? But that's probably the average. Would you agree with that in your experience?
Yeah. It's one of those things where a lot of times we're getting people just to go from 1 times frequency to 2, and that makes a big difference. And from there, we see like, okay, 2 is plenty. We don't even need to go more than that.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah.
And I think that's the cool thing. It's like, hey, 2 times is plenty, because we get to manage fatigue a little bit better, and as we keep saying, that's very important. But also, we get to practice the skill, and we get to maybe have a little bit differences in the rep range or in the load or whatever it is. Again, keeping it interesting. Saying, hey, we're hitting a little bit heavier squats today, or we're hitting a little bit more of higher rep squats today, and that might be different enough where someone is excited. They still get that exposure. They still get that training of the skill, but it's different enough. And depending on where we're on our goal, it's ticking multiple boxes, right? So a lot of the times, making that jump from 1 to 2 times frequency is huge, and it's sufficient. So again, a lot of people, 2 times is where they need to be. Then when you start to get into maybe, you're hitting those plateaus that we talked about, maybe the beginner gains aren't there as much, or you just want to experiment a little bit, you can start going to 3 times. But that's when it comes the idea of, again, fatigue management. Be careful of it, and be careful of which pattern you choose for that exercise, right? For your squat pattern, like you talked about, it doesn't have to be low bar squat all 3 days. It could be a low bar one day, high bar one day, and our other squat patterns leg press, right? We have it different enough where we're still doing a squat pattern and we're doing some purpose for it, but we're far away from competition, so we don't need to be doing all 3. Right? So I think the frequency is helpful. It's a little bit more important, as you said, for strength. I would agree. And sometimes we can get away with the higher frequency stuff. So long as, again, we don't see it affecting the neighbor lifts. And specifically what I mean there is like squat and deadlift, because they're very lower body dominant. It can have some effect and bleed into, one day from the other. So that kind of brings up the topic and the idea of, well, what's a weekly split look like, right? For hypertrophy, we talked about upper lower versus full body versus push pull legs briefly, but it's like for strength, do you have specific approaches that you take? Do you like upper lower? Is it any names to it? Is it all kind of full body, or it's, hey, here's a squat and bench day and then a deadlift day, or it's very focused on the main lifts? So what is your kind of approach with that?
Yeah, man. I think it depends on their training frequency, like total, how many days per week they're training, right?
Yeah.
It seems like most people usually were like 3 to 5 days a week is what most people end up doing, right? So if you do the math, and if we're trying to squat twice, deadlift twice, bench at least twice, right? It's pretty difficult to have everything have its own dedicated day at that point, unless you're going to the gym 6 days a week, which you totally can, right? That totally works. But I think often we're going to wind up doing multiple main lifts in the same day, or maybe it's your primary heaviest squat day with like some kind of secondary bench thing, or you can do all kinds of stuff like that. But yeah, in my experience, a lot of days wind up looking maybe not full body, but like it's not just lower body, or it's not just upper. There's going to be something in there. But yeah, it's certainly more towards the full body side than a lot of hypertrophy splits would be. But on that same note, I have a question for you. Do you think there's ever a place for like a slightly easier. One might even say like power type day for the purpose of managing fatigue within a microcycle. Have you ever heard of this?
I heard of it, and the answer is no, sadly.
Okay.
Basically, no. He's joking or was saying it seriously because it's like that's what I looked at for my PhD in a way. But yeah, I think that I was kind of giving you a question too, like a hard question, like upper, lower versus full. But like you said, it ends up being kind of full, and it very much just depends on your main lifts, right? You kind of send it around there. What it ends up being, the name doesn't matter too much. Kind of like we talked about in the last time, where it's like, oh, you said you're doing lower body, but you threw in some biceps because that's the only way you can get your volume in. Just basically don't have an attachment to the name. Get in what you need to get in, with the emphasis around recovery, right? And that's kind of where we're bringing it right now. Is when it comes to recovery, we're looking more so specifically of these main lifts and having potentially even like priority days, right? Where, hey, here's our heavy squat day. We want to make sure we're coming into this day as recovered and as fresh as we can, because that's our most important day, right? Maybe it's the lift I want to bring up the most, my hardest lift, the most demanding one, whatever it might be, but that's of priority. So let me focus on that. We can touch on that a lot more once my paper comes out that looks at that, which would be cool, because we did some investigation on, coaches themselves. We did a survey saying like, hey, what are you all doing? Do you even consider this? Like, what are you thinking about when you're making a microcycle of training? So it'd be cool with that. But yeah, like you said, sometimes having easier and light days just makes sense, right? Because you can't go hard all the time. For bodybuilding, we talked about you kind of can, but you probably shouldn't as well. You're going to have some easier days just because that's the way it works out. Yeah, that balance and that idea of emphasizing recovery, right? And with that, that's why maybe we don't have upper and lower specific days. Because if you do a lower body day and you trash yourself like you would a normal lower body bodybuilding day, are you going to be really recovered 48 hours after to hit your deadlift day? Maybe it's possible, but the more you do in one day for one muscle group, probably gonna need a little bit more time to recover, especially if it's purposeful, closer to failure, higher volume, right? And I think that's something to be mindful of. But if you kind of split up squat, bench, and a little bit of each, so you're maybe hitting at max like 3 or 4 direct sets potentially, right? Whatever it is, it's enough where 24 hours is sufficient to recover, or at least it's not going to negatively impact your next day's specific lift, right? I think so. There's that. And yeah, the lighter days are nice, man. Because like, again, if the way it is, if you have 2 hard days back to back, it can work, but it just takes a lot more thought into and effort. And sometimes, like you said, less is more. So if you can think less about stuff or worry less about it, because sometimes we create this barrier mentally where we're like, okay, I just did 3 sets of leg extensions yesterday. I don't know if my quad's gonna be recovered for my deadlifts tomorrow. You're like, really? Is it really going to affect you that much? Or now do you have that thought in your head so much that it is going to affect you? It's that mental thing where you're kind of setting your own boundary and barrier or whatever that might be. Right. So again, if we take some time early on to look at that weekly setup and be purposeful about it, have intentions for the day itself, the exercises itself, and integrate recovery being the main focus, it just makes it easier. Right. And again, hey, maybe bias speaking here because that's kind of what we looked at and what we talked about and what I like to look at and how I structure things. But I think it makes sense. And I think we have some literature to kind of back it up. Say, be recovered, especially for strength. Like we talked about fatigue management, again, important. I've said that so many times, but we keep repeating it because that's, again, we're always referring back to our main goal. And setting that up in that way and thinking about these things can be helpful in making it easier for us to determine hard days, easy days, squat focus day, low volume day, etc.
Yeah, 100%. Having that as like your North Star, being like we do not want to sabotage our performance at all. We're like we talked about last time, hypertrophy, like you probably can a little bit and it's not a huge deal, right? For this, the entire thing we care about is the performance. It's not just about is the set hard. It's what is the performance like? And so we want to make sure we're not sabotaging that. That's always, if any programming decision that we're making, if it's going to sabotage that, it's probably not the best choice, at least in an ideal world, right? You're going to work with a client whose availability is such that you're just going to have to make some slight compromises, right? Something that's maybe not perfect on paper. Maybe they have to do, they can only train Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday or something. It's always back-to-back days. We can't have a bunch of days off or, stuff like that's just going to happen. And you're going to have to get a little creative with fitting all these people. It's not just frequency now, right? They're so tied together, right? Because now I think a perfect example is really high frequency benching. Like if somebody's benching 4 or 5 times a week, they're probably benching every time they go to the gym, and it's always going to have it at least once every week where it's 2 days in a row. Sometimes twice it's happening, right? So we got to be very intentional. How are we programming that? So what I always come back to, and this is sort of tied to the squat and deadlift stuff that you mentioned earlier, like they're so closely related, that looking at the movement pattern and programming it based off of what's going to mitigate as much fatigue as possible, what's going to get me the stimulus that I want, but the least amount of fatigue, in that recipe being such that we're not going to impact the performance on the main day. If one of the like on bench, if your fifth most important day is sabotaged a little bit by fatigue, whatever, right? That's an evil that I will accept if the primary day is, if we're Gucci on that one. So
that's where you just put your close grip bench or your secondary bench movement or your accessory work, right? And that's
right.
where it starts to tie in those things of like priority of a main, primary versus accessory, all that stuff. Yeah.
Prioritizing stuff is very helpful. So like squat and deadlift stuff, I try to avoid doing them on the same day if I can. If I can split those up into 4 separate days, awesome. Obviously, if that doesn't work with someone's schedule, you got to make a compromise. And then similarly with bench, the same sort of subsequent decision making happens where it's like, okay, well, if I need to make a compromise and fatigue could be an issue, how am I allocating the volume, right? Not every day has to have the same number of sets. You can have a day where it's literally 1 set, or you could have it 2 sets or whatever, right? And the other day is 5 or 3, or, there's so many different ways that you can split this up, or maybe it's further from failure, right? And that's sort of the lever you're using to reduce the fatigue. And, you think about just all the different permutations of what can happen with that kind of stuff. Maybe it's the exercise selection also. You're doing a partial range of motion movement, all of a sudden it's way less fatiguing than, something with a really deep stretch or something, so just ultimately, I think what it comes down to, it's sort of like writing a paper for school or whatever, right? Like you have a first draft and then you need to look at it and see what you can improve. And then eventually you get to your final draft. So like when you're making a program, you're probably not going to have the perfect thing in mind. I very frequently, I don't think I've ever written a program and being like, oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to change, like there's always something I'm tweaking. And so before I send it to the client, right? So like you write the thing out, try to be spacing things out in a way that seems like it's going to be the least fatiguing. And then you're going to sit back and be like, damn it. Like I have the primary squat and the primary deadlift on back-to-back days. And so he's doing a really heavy deadlift, tons of RDLs, and then main low bar squat the next day. Can we do better than that? Probably, right? Maybe we can tweak something where they're just not going to be thrashed before they go try to squat as heavy as possible. So then you're going to go in, you're going to tweak something, and oops, that caused this downstream thing. Now I got to fix that. And, so there's going to be all kinds of stuff, but trying to make sure that you are avoiding the overlapping fatigue as much as possible, playing with not only the spacing of the lifts, but the volume and the RPEs and stuff like we mentioned, the exercise selection. I always try to make, like, if possible, I always have one day for each of the main lifts that's the primary day. It's going to be the heaviest or the most specific. So I'll try to place that following the most number of rest days possible, right? So if you're squatting twice a week, one of them's probably going to be coming off of 3 days of rest, and one of them's going to be coming off of 2 days of rest. I try to put the primary one coming off 3 days of rest if I can. Sometimes it just doesn't work out perfectly. That's okay. There's ways to kind of make up for that with other stuff like we've talked about, but it's a process, dude, and it's much less flexible than the hypertrophy stuff, but it's still very doable. You just got to be willing to, put that first draft on paper and then edit it maybe a couple times. And what's wrong with that, right? And then also at the end of the day, you just got to go try it and see because some people, dude, I've had some people where they're doing a program that if I tried to do it, I would fall to pieces. No way, right? And vice versa. Sometimes I'm like, dude, this is easy. What do you mean you're super beat up? But they're just super beat up, right? So ultimately, you got to do your best to make a program that accounts for all the stuff we've talked about, and then have yourself or the client or whoever try it out, give it a week or two, whatever, and then adapt it over time. And you're going to fine tune things. You're going to get more and more individualized, more and more customized, and it all works out in the end if you're paying attention, getting that feedback, and working together. But yeah, I've rambled a lot. Do you have any additional insights?
And it wasn't a ramble. It was very cohesive and it made sense. And it was helpful because, like you said, like we always talk about again, you have to test it out. But I think what's interesting is here we spent a lot of time on frequency for strength. Well, we didn't too much for hypertrophy. But that's because we're utilizing the tool of frequency to disseminate our volume and our strength, and to prioritize squat day versus deadlift day, and these other things to think about, because that's just a good way to approach it, right? Our goal in the beginning is different, so our approach is likely going to be different too. And this is a very blatant example of that. Right, so the frequency is just ends up being a lot more useful tool, especially if we're looking at it, the main lifts that we want to focus on. We talked a lot like squat, bench, deadlift, but for example, if you wanted overhead press to be part of that, very well doable. Whatever your focus is, whatever your strength meaning is, you're just kind of keeping that the priority and adjusting accordingly and going into it as recovered as possible. If you focus on that takes you most of the way, right? And like we talked about, and it's the frequency, volume, intensity, they all do play a role. So because we touched on frequency a bit and it makes the most sense, and we did briefly with the volume and intensity, I think it'd be good to touch upon that a little bit more, specifics for volume. So in that case, if you're looking at volume, you kind of said it before, are you looking at sets per the main lifts? That's how you're kind of programming it, right? Like, hey, we're doing 3 sets or 6 sets throughout the week of the main lift, or whatever that is. Is that how you kind of approach it? And then break that up with the frequency, or
Yeah. Yeah. So
volume's tough. This volume's tough.
It's tough, and even more so with this new. When I get this per session volume meta-analysis done and out there will be some additional things that we can talk about a little bit. But without getting into specific results from that, the paper I mentioned earlier, the sort of weekly volume and frequency stuff and how that impacts strength and hypertrophy, I think we get some good insights from that. There is still a dose response of volume for strength, but it is way smaller and tapers off way faster than the hypertrophy one does. By far, I can't state this strongly enough, by far, the biggest benefit you're getting is going from 0 to 1 set per week, right? Like, now, limitations of the studies, right? They're not super advanced powerlifters. They're not crazy strong. Some of the stuff is, the strength test was like isometric knee extension, right? So it's not quite the same as like working with advanced powerlifters. So I would hazard to guess there's a little bit more volume that we probably don't want to do 1 set a week, right? I wouldn't use that number as the takeaway. I would just say that it's not as much volume as we probably think we need to do. In a lot of cases, if we're doing a lift 2 or 3 times a week, if we're doing, I think this is where we need to lean on coaching experience a lot also, right? Like, the research is great, but it's super limited also. But if we're doing, probably, super high frequency, you might have stuff where you're doing 1 set in that session and that's it, right? And I think that's great. But we're probably looking at, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 sets of a main, like if we have like a top set and maybe 1 or 2 back off sets or whatever. I think that's a great way to go. 2 or 3 times a week. Awesome. Some people, do in fact benefit from higher volume. Maybe they do 4 back off sets or whatever, right? Maybe they don't even have a top set. It's just some straight sets. That's also fine. Maybe that's an interesting thing we can dig into in a more like advanced programming stuff discussion or something. But bottom line, I think, don't go crazy with the volume, because remember, like we keep saying, strength is a little bit sensitive to fatigue. And if we're doing so much, it's a super easy thing to keep an eye on, right? Like, if you're starting to feel beat up and your strength is not progressing like we might otherwise expect it to, just because you're showing up, you're still fatigued, you're probably doing too much, dude, right? It's that simple, I think. Just do a little bit less and try that out, and you're probably fine. And, on the other hand, if you're not making any progress at all by doing your 1 set once a week, add a second set, probably, but yeah, we should be able to be a little bit more precise onto how to best split things up into the frequency once my per session paper comes out.
Yeah,
hopefully very soon.
I think it's good it didn't yet, because now we're focusing on on like the basic thing, because it is still like a basic intro to strength programming, right? And a lot of times basics are what matter the most, right? And we have to just focus on that. And I think you put it so well, and that's how I would explain it too. It's just less is going to be more, especially for, in this case, especially for strength specific, especially for volume. A lot of times people run into the small off program, right? Where it's like, hey, we're doing 8 sets of 6 on the barbell back squat in 1 session.
It works great for the short term, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then when you hit the wall, what happens? Do you add more? You're going to be doing 20 sets for squat, but you can't manage that fatigue. You just can't. So it, as complex as it can be, it really does not need to be in this case for volume. So just less is more. Keep it on the low end, like super low end. Just, go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2. Make those really good sets, and then from there, see how fatigue is and recovery is, and what you can get away with, and vary that depending on where you're at in the block and how much recovery you need, right? But it can be so simple as that. So I think that was just very well put.
I think thanks. I think that the other, and you mentioned this a couple times earlier too, to bring it back around to this, like accessory work and stuff. To what extent does that help drive strength? It's a very difficult question to answer. We're trying to answer it. We're trying to get some insight towards it with our meta in terms of quantifying the volume as like fractional sets, and which for strength it's a little bit different, right? It's like if the outcome measure of the study is a squat 1RM, direct sets are squatting, right? To the same range of motion, all that kind of stuff. Anything else is indirect. So like half squats, hack squat, leg extension, whatever, right? Or in this research, this is again part of why this is one of the limitations of the study. If the outcome measure is isometric knee extension, then dynamic leg extensions that you're doing in a normal gym, that's not counting as a direct set, right? Because it's not exactly the same as the outcome measure. So it's going to be really difficult to, we're not going to have the answer, I guess is what I'm saying. Even though we're trying to quantify sets in this fractional sense and try to get at it a little bit, it's just not going to be perfect. And so we need to lean on that a little bit, but I think more so onto coaching experience and use the research for, I think, what it is good for, that like probably most of the bang for our buck for driving strength is the kind of direct stuff that's like very, very close, if not the same thing that you're trying to get really strong. Low bar back squat, sumo deadlift, conventional deadlift, pull-ups, whatever, right? But like I would say that what we're seeing is that indirect sets or related work, secondary stuff, accessory stuff, it's not useless, right? So I think that's even more, which lines up with what coaches have found over the last however many years, right? Like you don't only do this normal bench press, right? You're going to have some variations. Maybe you have a close grip or a spoto or a tempo, or maybe you do some dumbbells or a machine or whatever, right? There's all kinds of stuff. So when it comes to allocating volume, what I tend to do, and I'd be interested to get your 2 cents on this too, obviously, is if it's like a hypertrophy phase, going back to that periodized structure that we mentioned earlier, if we're focusing more on hypertrophy, I tend to, what's like a pretty low dose of the specific strength stuff, like normal bench press, for example, and then more of the work, although still keeping an eye on not letting the volume get too high because we're going to sabotage our performance a little bit. More of that work is into, a Larson press or a feet up bench or a close grip bench or dumbbells or machines or whatever, right? And then if we transition to like a general strength phase, shifting that dial a little bit, right? A little bit more of the volume is the specific stuff, a little bit less is the more hypertrophy oriented, less specific stuff, so on and so forth. That's how I tend to approach it for the most part, right? So there's certainly a spectrum of all that stuff. Do you agree with that, or do you do something different?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's where, again, coming like that, the strength hypertrophy spectrum is very important. I think that's where giving intent and purpose for specific exercises and blocks is important too. Because again, okay, we're in a hypertrophy block. Goal is to build muscle. Cool. What builds muscle? Mechanical tension, hitting the muscle group that we actually want to work. As we talked about in the last episode, sometimes a barbell back squat isn't the greatest for that because so many external variables that can then limit that, and we're not getting to the appropriate stimulus that we need. So why would we throw a ton of volume in this movement that's not as proficient in stimulating hypertrophy, right? That's just, and we're getting all this fatigue on top of it. So that's where, when we're far away from competition for strength or just strength specific stuff, the volume is coming from bodybuilding movements. It's coming from the machines. It's coming from secondary movements. I think, again, the further away from competition and you are, the more likely it's going to be more hypertrophy. So it's almost like that inverse relationship in a way, where it's like we're doing the minimum, a top single maybe, and 1 or 2 back offs of like 4 reps, right? Keep it's pretty similar with strength. Keep it very straightforward, where you're maintaining at most that skill in that attention and that desire to hit something heavy, but it's not coming along with all this fatigue. And then we're just getting the bulk of the hypertrophy work through good hypertrophy exercises and volume with manageable fatigue and all that. So it becomes pretty, again, simple when you really have those anchors of these the North Stars, like you said, and these things that we're focusing on and doing so early on. So yeah, I think that's kind of approach it a similar way, and
Awesome.
kind of tying that in with the intensity side of things, right? Because I think this is very dependent on where you're at in terms of your block and your goals. But one of the common things you always hear is, okay, strength 1 to 5 reps is strength, and hitting it pretty heavy to failure, or at least your 5 rep max, 1 rep max, 2 rep max, whatever it is, and it can be. But it doesn't have to be. Again, it depends on what your strength means. And then again comes the idea of managing the fatigue. Just because you're strength focused, are you going to be hitting 3x3s to failure all the time? Probably not, right? And then again, when is it appropriate to lean into higher rep stuff versus lower rep stuff? So again, it just, when you're trying to figure that out for yourself, come back to that specificity, come back to that goal. Where should I be on here? But one thing that I want to touch upon is, I think what we're starting to get to is, because we're prioritizing fatigue management, because we know that heavy stuff is fatiguing and high volume stuff is fatiguing, we're going to do less in terms of volume. And for load specific, intensity specific, maybe we're also being further away from failure, but being very purposeful about moving that load as fast as we can. Right. And that's something we're starting to see, is if we're moving with max intent, so on the way up, you're trying to move that way as fast as you can. Like, well, of course, within the constraints of still making it technically sound, right, and not being injurious or whatever it is, but just moving as fast as we can, because then we're theoretically recruiting the muscle fibers that we want to. We're getting a quote unquote strength stimulus, but without the fatigue that comes along with the heavy stuff. And that's kind of a newer concept that we're starting to see, but I think it's something that is very useful. I think it is beneficial. Again, maybe it's coming from like a bias thing, or just in practice, like this is what I like to have strength specific people do, because we have the stuff where it makes sense, but maybe we don't have as much research right now to back it up. But is that something, like, what are your thoughts on that idea of moving things fast, lower loads, probably going to be nice for strength stimulus? Yeah,
I'm very, very much with you. That doesn't mean that everything has to be far from failure, right?
Because the specificity comes into play, right? If you want to be good at a 1 rep max, you need to be good at handling a 1 rep max, because that is a 100%. Very, very skillful thing. Like heavy load, grinding it, all that stuff. Yes. But yeah,
and it can be scary too, right? Like, yes. Like I would get so anxious, right? Like I started doing much more frequent. I ended up being that guy who would do a single at like RPE 7 or 8 every single time I was at the gym, because I just needed to work through the anxiety of handling heavier weights, right? But so yeah, I think we should definitely do that an episode soon on like more advanced or more detailed stuff. I don't want to say advanced because it sounds like it's better, but just more detailed stuff. That like there's a very good argument for doing like some sort of top set where it's getting heavier and heavier. That's why it's closer to failure, right? Because it's heavier. Whereas if you're getting closer to failure because the load is increasing like that, it's probably a good thing. If you're getting closer to failure because you're just doing more and more reps at the same submaximal load, probably not helping you very much, right? There's figures showing both of those things in Zach Robinson's meta regressions on proximity to failure, that dose response with hypertrophy and strength. That you can, you look at the impact of reps in reserve on strength, right? When it's mediated by reps at the same load, right? It's literally a horizontal line. Yeah. There is no benefit of getting closer and closer to failure, right? So, do you want to be 20 reps away from failure? Probably not, right? We want to be somewhere. It's got to be somewhat challenging, but as long as the load is moderately heavy, you probably don't want to go super close to failure, like you're saying for the, so usually what this might look like, maybe you have a top set that's getting heavier every week, closer to failure on that front. Your back off sets, maybe they're a bit more static. Maybe there's some movement with the loads, but we're keeping a handful of reps in reserve there, trying, as you said, very importantly, move that rep quickly on the concentric, and while maintaining control. We don't want to get too squirrely with it, right? Yeah. You don't want to lose balance or whatever. But yeah, I very much agree on that. And then when you go to do some of your accessory stuff that's kind of bodybuilding focused or hypertrophy focused, that's where you can go, exercise your demons on the leg extension or whatever. We don't need to do it on the with a barbell on your back necessarily. But I think this is a very interesting point, and I'd love to get your insight on this too. That this is kind of why maxing out strength and hypertrophy at the same time is really kind of impossible, right? Maxing out each, because they, too much. If you're maxing out hypertrophy, it generates enough fatigue. It's going to sabotage your performance, which is the exact thing we don't want for strength, right? And if we're doing any strength work that we're doing is fatiguing and not very time efficient, and we probably could do more sets closer to failure and get even more hypertrophy out of it. So we got to make some kind of trade-off there. At least I think so.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's why, if you heard us talk about in this episode, our operational definitions of frequency and volume and intensity were very different from hypertrophy. We talk about different things. We spent more time talking about ones than the others. Our approach is different. They're the same. We're still talking about volume, but that means something different. We still have goals, but they look very different. They're very specific. We're very intentional about what words we use for strength and how we're approaching it, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. And you can logically get to that point where there's going to be some competition. Not that it's impossible to do both, the whole power building style, but it's a little bit harder. It's going to take more time, more effort. And then that's where the idea of the periodization maybe comes into play a lot more. And even more so if you're more strength specific, right? Because you kind of need some variation. You need some greater fatigue management in some areas than other, right? Because when the strength focus stuff comes up, you gotta dial back some of the hypertrophy stuff. Because like I said, if that's the goal, is that conducive to the goal? In this case, it's not. So we need to adjust. So it's you're basically playing that balancing act a little bit more with strength, and then even more so if you want to get a little bit of both. But that's where it comes down to very specific goals for yourself. General goal, specific goal of the macro cycle, specific goal of the meso cycle, specific goal of the micro cycle, specific goal of the exercise. Right? It's
the rep range of the everything.
Yeah, and it sounds like we're beating a dead horse, but it's important. And again, it sounds like a lot of effort as well, but it's not that much, and a little bit early on goes so far, and it's just I can't like emphasize that enough, because if you really think about the stuff, you won't hit those walls as much later on, or if you do, you'll have a better toolkit to address it, right? Because maybe we've been there before, or we have systems in place where if we need recovery, we're auto-regulating and adjusting in some way already, right? So it's just, we want to talk about program design because yes, we can just go in and lift and make some progress, sure, but I think a little effort goes a long way, especially here, right? And this is where then comes in like that whole butting heads of science-based versus just bro it out and train. And it doesn't need to be that way. We can each learn from either. We can all go through that, but it's important that I think you think about program design to some degree. Start with very clear definitions of goals of everything that we just talked about, and then assess, do your own science, and you'll get there. And in a visualization, and just adjust.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else. I think anything else that I would have to add would be getting deep into some very specific weeds that might be better served with its own discussion. So, but we should definitely do that soon. That'd be fun.
I think so. Yeah, because it is fun. Because as much as it's helpful to be very broad and start somewhere, and that's why this episode is here. But like you said, if you're someone that's more intermediate, more advanced, or you've been in the game longer, and this is something you want to think about, or you've tried everything else and want to figure it out, we can talk about those things, right? And that's where it's fun, because it's more of, hey, this is our experience, or this is what the really nitty gritty science stuff says, and this is how we applied it. And that's we just nerd out over that stuff, so that's cool. But if you're already at that point and you don't want to wait, I don't know, how did they approach it, Jake? What do they do?
Just random guesses, dude. I mean,
I think so.
Try something. At the end of the day, like we said a million times for strength, just try harder. If it's not working, do more volume.
Do more than the last time.
Closer to failure.
That's it. Just do more.
1 RM every day, multiple times a day. Probably smart, right?
Scroll on Instagram. Do one scroll up, pause it, whichever exercise that person's doing, do that.
There you go. Exactly right. Exactly right. No, I think if you're finding yourself stuck, if in doubt, always come back to those base level principles. What is the goal? Don't sabotage performance. Probably less is more, right? Even though that's difficult psychologically to do. And at the end of the day, if that's still not working, pay Colby or I some money and we'll fix it for you. How about that?
Wow, I didn't even set up that whole bait line. So you just did that, and just I guess that's what it is. But yeah,
I love how I've made enough jokes about that throughout this podcast that people probably think I do only care about money.
It comes from the place of we love this stuff. We're passionate about coaching. We want to help people. And as you can see us talking about it, there's so much to think about. But hey, we put in the work to do all the thinking for you ahead of time. That's why we studied it. And now we're here to share that knowledge. And it ultimately comes down to that. We want to share it. We want to help people. And getting a coach can be helpful. And we're pretty cool dudes. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and that's also why we're doing it. Like, that's also why we give the information away for free, because like coaching is a luxury, right? And it is a really cool thing. It can fast track stuff. It can be really fun. Like, you can make genuine, really deep, lasting friendship. Like, there's so much cool stuff that happens, but it's not for everybody. Some people, it's just not a good fit for their lifestyle, their preferences, or financially, or whatever, right? There's so many reasons to not do it. So while it is great, and while we do want to be able to pay our rent and stuff like that, it's very important also that neither of us are salesmen by any means, and that's the last thing we want, is to come off that way. So always go the free route first. Uncover those stones for yourself. See if you can figure it out. If you can't, we're always here as a resource.
Exactly. We just appreciate you being here. Appreciate you tuning in for another episode. It was a great one. As always, we look forward to the next one, and we'll catch you then.
Yeah.
Peace.